The autumn rain of 1955 fell on Seoul not to cleanse, but to remind. It turned the gray dust of Reconstruction into a thick, clinging mud that coated the boots of men like Detective Park Jin-woo and seemed to seep into the very soul of the city. From his second-floor window at the Jongno police station, Park watched the city rebuild itself with a weary, almost detached resignation. Scaffolding clung to the skeletons of bombed-out buildings like desperate vines, and the percussive rhythm of hammers was the city's new, stuttering heartbeat. The war had ended 2 years ago, but its ghost lingered in the hollow eyes of the street vendors, the limp of the old man selling roasted sweet potatoes, and the sheer number of children without parents. His office was a cramped space that smelled of damp wool, stale cigarette smoke, and ink. A single, naked bulb cast a jaundiced glow over stacks of files, threatening to avalanche onto the floor. Each folder was a small tragedy, a testament to the chaos that festered in the cracks of a recovering nation. Petty thefts, black market disputes, brawls fueled by cheap soju. They were endless, and he was tired. Detective Park, a young officer, Kim, stood at his door, holding a thin manila folder as if it were a soiled rag. Officer Kim was barely 20, his face still unlined by the cynicism that had etched itself deep around Park's own eyes and mouth. He was too eager, too full of a belief in justice that the war should have extinguished. "What is it, Kim?" Park didn't turn from the window. Another runaway, he could feel it. A new case. From the Namsan Children's Home. Kim stepped inside, his boots squeaking on the linoleum. A boy, 8 years old. Name is Choi Min-jun. He's been gone for 2 days now. Park finally turned, taking the file. He flipped it open. A small, black and white photograph was clipped to the inside. A boy with large, dark eyes and a haircut that looked like it had been done with a bowl and dull shears. He wasn't smiling. None of them ever were. Last seen during evening mealtime, October 12th. Park read aloud, his voice flat. No signs of struggle, no witnesses to him leaving. The director thinks he might have tried to find relatives in Busan. It's a common story. He was about to close the file, to add it to the mountain of low-priority sorrows on his desk, when Officer Kim cleared his throat. "There's more, sir. This arrived this morning." Kim placed a small, square package wrapped in brown paper on the corner of the desk. It was unmarked, save for the station's address written in clumsy, blocky Hangul. No stamp, no postmark. It had been hand-delivered. Park eyed it with suspicion before carefully tearing the paper. Inside, nestled in a bed of rough twine, was a single reel of audio tape. A label, neatly typed in English, was stuck to the plastic reel. It read, October 10, 1955. Park frowned, a knot tightening in his stomach. Reel-to-reel recorders were not common. They were expensive, bulky machines, usually owned by the American military, radio broadcasters, or the very wealthy. Not the kind of thing you found in an orphanage or on the streets of Namdaemun Market. "The date," Kim said, his voice barely a whisper. "The boy, Min-jun, he disappeared on the 12th. The tape is dated the 10th. Park's weariness was instantly burned away by a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline. He stood up, grabbing the reel. Get the player from storage. Now, the only machine they had was a hulking, American-made Webster Chicago model, likely liberated from a military surplus depot. It took Kim 10 minutes to haul it into the office, and another 5 for them to figure out how to thread the thin, brown tape through the series of guides and heads. Park flicked a switch, and the reels began to turn with a low, mechanical whir. For a moment, there was only the hiss of static, a sound like an empty seashell held to the ear. Then, a sound emerged from the crackling void. It was the faint, tinny sound of a child humming. The melody was a simple, common folk tune, the kind a mother might sing to her baby. It was innocent, aimless. In the background, Park could just make out the distant clatter of a trolley and the cry of a street vendor. The recording was made somewhere in the city, out in the open. The humming continued for about a minute, pure and untroubled. It made the hair on Park's arms stand on end. Then the humming stopped. There was a shuffling sound, the scrape of a shoe on pavement. A new voice, a man's, spoke in a low, muffled tone. The words were indistinct, lost in the poor quality of the recording. The child's voice replied, higher-pitched, questioning. Another muffled response from the man. Suddenly, the atmosphere of the recording changed. There was a sharp, startled gasp from the child. The sound of a struggle, fabric tearing, a dull thud. The child's voice cried out, no longer questioning, but panicked. "No, please!" The man's voice was louder now, a harsh, guttural command. And then the screaming began. It was not a child's tantrum. It was the raw, undiluted sound of pure terror. It was high-pitched and piercing, a sound that bypassed the ears and drilled directly into the base of the skull. Park felt his own breath catch in his chest. Officer Kim, pale as a sheet, took a half step back from the machine. The screams were choked off, replaced by ragged, desperate sobs and muffled pleas that were abruptly cut short. A final, heavy thud. Then, silence. Only the hiss of the empty tape remained. Park's hand shot out and slammed the stop button. The abrupt silence in the office was somehow louder than the screams had been. The smell of rain and smoke seemed to thicken, to suffocate. He stared at the motionless reels, his mind racing. He picked up the case file again, his eyes darting from the date of disappearance, October 12th, to the label on the tape, October 10th. It wasn't a recording of a crime. It was a prelude, a rehearsal, or a promise. 2 full days before the boy was even known to be missing, someone had recorded his final, terrifying moments. The cold logic of it was more horrifying than any ghost story. This wasn't chaos. This was calculated. This was a monster who not only stole a child, but took the time to document his own evil, dating it like a trophy before the hunt had even officially begun. The silence in the room was heavier than any sound. The only noise was the soft, rhythmic flap of the loose end of the tape striking the reel with each rotation. Officer Kim stared at the machine, his face pale, his youthful optimism seeming to have evaporated in the space of 3 horrifying minutes. Park Jin-woo, however, felt a cold, sharp clarity piercing through his usual weariness. The familiar fog of cynicism had been burned away, replaced by the chilling certainty of pure evil. He reached out and switched off the machine, plunging the room into absolute quiet. For a moment, he let the weight of it settle on them both. The screams were no longer just sound. They were a presence in the room, an artifact of a crime meticulously planned and executed. "Kim," Park said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the tension. "Get the car. We're going to the Namsan Children's Home." The drive across Seoul was a journey through a city of ghosts and half-finished dreams. The sky was a uniform, oppressive gray, threatening a rain that never came. Buildings still bearing the pockmarks of shrapnel stood beside new, hastily erected structures. On the streets, the faces of the people were etched with a collective exhaustion, the quiet resilience of a populace that had survived the unthinkable. Park drove in silence, the rattling of the old police jeep a meager percussion against the phantom screams echoing in his mind. He glanced at Kim, who was gripping the dashboard, his knuckles white. The boy was seeing the real face of the world today, the one hidden beneath procedure and paperwork. The Namsan Children's Home was a large, foreboding structure, a relic of the colonial era repurposed for a new, sadder function. Its gray stucco walls were stained with damp, and patches of paint had peeled away like sunburnt skin. The yard was a wide expanse of packed, cold dirt where a few children in patched clothing stood motionless, watching the police jeep approach with wide, vacant eyes. There was no laughter here, no games, just a waiting stillness. They were met at the door by the director, a woman in her late 50s named Mrs. Kang. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, tight bun, and her clothes, though clean, were threadbare at the cuffs. She carried herself with an air of brittle authority, but the deep lines around her eyes spoke of a fatigue that went bone deep. She led them into a small, cluttered office that smelled sharply of disinfectant and aging paper. "Detectives," she said, her tone clipped and devoid of warmth. "I filed the report yesterday. Have you found Choi Min-jun? Boys his age, they have a habit of wandering. I'm sure he'll return when he gets hungry." She was already building a wall, dismissing the issue as a simple case of a runaway. Park didn't sit. He placed the heavy reel-to-reel recorder on the corner of her cluttered desk, the action deliberate and loud in the quiet office. "We have reason to believe this is more serious, Mrs. Kang," he stated calmly. "We need you to listen to something. We need you to confirm if you recognize the voice." Her eyes narrowed at the machine, a flicker of suspicion crossing her features. "A recording? What is the meaning of this?" "Please," Park said, his gaze unwavering. "Just listen." He pressed the play button. The soft hiss filled the office, followed by the innocent, off-key humming. Mrs. Kang's stern expression softened for a fraction of a second, a glimmer of recognition. Then the humming stopped. The sound of a struggle, a muffled cry, the boy's voice rising in panic. "Please no, let me go." Mrs. Kang's facade shattered. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. The carefully constructed wall of professional detachment crumbled into dust. And then came the screams, raw, piercing, and utterly final before the abrupt silence. Park stopped the tape. Mrs. Kang was trembling, her face ashen. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks. She sank into her chair, a choked sob escaping her lips. She could only nod, unable to speak. After a long moment, she finally found her voice, a ragged whisper. That was him. That was Min Jun. He always hummed that little song when he thought no one was listening. The confirmation landed like a physical blow. It was real. The boy on the tape was their missing orphan. Park let her compose herself for a moment before he pressed on, his voice softer now, but no less insistent. "Mrs. Kang, I need you to think. Was there anyone new around the home? Any visitors? Did anyone show Min Jun unusual attention?" Her shock quickly curdled back into defensiveness, a desperate attempt to regain control. "No, impossible. This is a safe place. We have protocols. Our donors are vetted. Our staff is loyal. I protect these children. The war took their families. We give them a home." Her voice cracked with a mixture of grief and indignation. "He was a quiet boy," she continued, wringing her hands. "He mostly kept to himself, lost in his own world since he arrived." She paused, her mind searching. "But he did talk to one of the new girls sometimes. Soo Jin. She arrived about a month ago, found wandering near Namdaemun Market. She doesn't speak much either. We need to speak with her," Park said. Instantly, Mrs. Kang's defenses went back up, harder than before. "Absolutely not," she snapped, her eyes flashing. "You will not bring this horror into the dormitories. You will not traumatize these children further. They have seen more than any child ever should. This is a home, detective, not an interrogation room." Park saw the unshakable fear in her eyes, fear that this poison had seeped inside her walls, that one of her children had been taken from under her nose. He could get a warrant and force the issue, but he knew it would only terrify the children and make Soo Jin impossible to talk to. He made a calculated retreat. "Very well, Mrs. Kang, for now." As they walked back to the Jeep, the gray sky finally broke, releasing a cold, miserable drizzle. Kim was fuming. "She's obstructing us. How can she not want to help?" "She's terrified, Kim," Park said, starting the engine. The wipers began to squeak across the windshield. "She's scared that the one safe place she could offer these children has been violated, but she gave us a name. Soo Jin." He pulled the Jeep away from the curb, the orphanage shrinking in the rearview mirror. "That tape recorder," Park mused, his mind already moving to the next piece. "It's not a common household item, likely American or German military surplus. It's expensive, precise. Our killer isn't just some brute. He's careful, he has resources. When we get back, I want you to start making a list. Every importer, every high-end electronics shop, every pawn broker near a military base. Find out who in Seoul sells these machines." As they drove back into the heart of the city, Park felt the true weight of the case settling upon him. He had a victim's name and a ghost's voice, but the killer was a phantom, a meticulous predator hiding in a city of millions. And somewhere in that sad, gray building, a little girl named Soo Jin might hold the key. The biting November wind whipped down the slopes of Namsan Mountain, carrying with it the scent of coal smoke and damp earth. Detective Park Jin-woo sat in his unmarked sedan, the engine off to conserve precious fuel, a thin blanket of condensation obscuring the grim facade of the orphanage across the street. He'd been there for 3 hours, a thermos of lukewarm barley tea his only comfort against the creeping cold. Every so often, a group of children would spill into the barren yard, their thin coats pulled tight, their shouts and laughter sounding frail against the vast, gray sky. He scanned each face, looking for one in particular. "This is pointless," he muttered to himself, rubbing his gloved hands together. His frustration with Mrs. Kang had simmered into a cold resolve. Her fear of scandal was a wall, and he couldn't break it down without causing the very harm she sought to prevent. But letting it go was not an option. Not with the sound of that tape seared into his memory. The switch from innocent humming to pure, unadulterated terror was a sound he knew would visit him in his sleep for years to come. He had to see the girl, Soo-jin. He had to look in her eyes and see if she held the key. Meanwhile, 20 minutes away by streetcar, Officer Kim was navigating a different part of Seoul's fractured world. He stepped off the clattering vehicle into the bustling streets of Myeongdong. Here, the scars of war were more cleverly hidden beneath a veneer of commerce and desperate optimism. Tailor shops with Western-style suits in the windows stood next to stalls selling roasted chestnuts. The air was thick with the chatter of vendors and the occasional roar of a U.S. military jeep. This was where money, both old and new, Korean and foreign, came to be spent. Kim clutched the note in his pocket. It contained the technical specifications Park had transcribed from the tape machine. A Telefunken Magnetophon KL65, a German model. It was a piece of equipment more suited to a radio station or a recording studio than a private individual. His first few stops had been fruitless. Small repair shops run by old men who only knew how to fix radios shook their heads, their eyes wide at the mention of such a foreign and expensive device. Finally, he found himself outside Bando Trading Co., a shop with a polished glass window displaying imported cameras, Swiss watches, and American fountain pens. It catered to a clientele far removed from the ration lines and struggles of the average CU-lite. Taking a breath, Kim pushed open the heavy wooden door, a small bell announcing his arrival. A man in a crisp white shirt and tie looked up from behind a glass counter. He was older, with slicked-back hair and an air of professional politeness. "May I help you, officer?" he asked, his eyes briefly flicking to Kim's uniform. Kim placed his notepad on the counter. "I am making inquiries about a specific piece of audio equipment, a reel-to-reel tape recorder, German, a Telefunken KL65. The shopkeeper's eyebrows rose slightly. "Ah, a very fine machine, an enthusiast's choice. We are one of the few licensed importers for Telefunken in all of Korea. It is not a common item. Very expensive." He leaned forward, his voice lowering conspiratorially. "Mostly, we sell them to American officers or government agencies, not a hobby for most people these days. Have you sold one recently?" Kim asked, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. "To a Korean civilian." The man paused, tapping a long finger on the counter. He closed his eyes for a moment, accessing a mental ledger. "It is unusual, so it stands out. Yes, I believe so. About 2, maybe 3 weeks ago, a gentleman came in. He knew exactly what he wanted." Kim leaned in, trying to keep his voice even. "Can you describe him?" "Well-dressed, very much so. A Western-style wool coat, good quality. Polished shoes, you don't see that often. He was quiet, polite, spoke very softly, very precisely. Not like the usual types who come in here to show off their new money." The shopkeeper seemed to appreciate the man's understated manner. "He paid in cash, clean American dollars. Said it was for a linguistic project. Recording dialects, I think he said." "His age, anything else?" Kim pressed, his pen scratching furiously across his notepad. "Hard to say, 40s perhaps." He wore a hat. But his hands, they were clean. No calluses. The hands of a scholar or an office worker, not a laborer. He shrugged. That's all I remember. He was unremarkable except for his fine taste and his quiet money. Unremarkable. The word sent a chill down Kim's spine. A ghost who could afford the best equipment to record his crimes. "Thank you," Kim said, his mind racing. "You've been very helpful." Back in his car, Park's patience was finally rewarded. The heavy wooden door of the orphanage creaked open, and a line of about a dozen children, bundled in mismatched coats and scarves, were led out by a young female caretaker. They walked in a loose column down the street, heading towards a small local market. Park watched them, his eyes scanning the group. And there she was, at the very back of the line, trailing a few feet behind the others. Soo-jin, a small, thin girl, her head bowed against the wind, clutching a small object in her hand. This was his chance. It was risky, unprofessional, but it was all he had. He got out of the car and followed them at a distance, melting into the sparse pedestrian traffic. At the market, the caretaker was quickly distracted, haggling with a vendor over the price of cabbages. The other children dispersed slightly, pointing at trinkets and sweets. Soo-jin remained where she was, near the entrance of the market, staring at the ground. Park walked past a stall selling hotteok, the sweet, fried pancakes filling the air with a cinnamon scent. He bought one, the warm paper wrapping a welcome heat in his palm. He approached the girl slowly, crouching down to her level so as not to intimidate her. "Hello," he said softly. She flinched, her eyes, large and dark in her pale face, darting up to meet his. He saw a depth of fear in them that startled him. This was not the shyness of a child. It was the petrified silence of a witness. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, keeping his voice low and calm. He offered the pancake. "Are you hungry?" She stared at the offering but didn't move. Her knuckles were white where she clutched the object in her hand. Park saw it was a small, smooth river stone painted with a crude, smiling face. A child's treasure. "That's a nice stone," he said. "Did you paint it?" She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Was it a gift?" he asked gently. "From your friend, from Minjun?" The name was a physical blow. The girl's breath hitched. Her eyes darted away from him, past the market stalls, towards a narrow, dark alleyway between two buildings a block away. It was a fleeting glance, lasting no more than a second, but it was filled with such undiluted terror that Park's blood ran cold. She saw something there. Before he could say another word, the caretaker's sharp voice cut through the air. "Soo-jin, who is this man? Get away from her." The woman bustled over, grabbing Soo-jin's arm and pulling her away protectively. She shot Park a venomous glare. "Leave these children alone." Park stood up slowly, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "My apologies, I meant no harm." He backed away, melting back into the crowd, the uneaten pancake growing cold in his hand. He didn't get a name or a confession. He didn't get a single word, but he got something more important. He got confirmation. The girl knew. She saw what happened to Minjun, and she was terrified not of a memory, but of a place. A dark alley, just a stone's throw from the market. That evening, Kim found Park back at the precinct, staring at the silent tape recorder on his desk as if it might speak. The air was thick with cigarette smoke. "I found something, sir," Kim said, placing his notes on the desk. Park looked up, his face grim. "So did I." The alley was a scar running behind the Namsen children's home, a grimy channel that funneled away the neighborhood's secrets. Detective Park stood at its mouth, the morning light struggling to pierce the oppressive gloom cast by the leaning walls of brick and peeling plaster. A fine, persistent drizzle had begun to fall, slicking the cobblestones and amplifying the scent of decay, wet garbage, stagnant water, and the faint, acrid smell of coal smoke. This was the place Soo-jin's terror had pointed to. He could feel it in the cold air that clung to his coat. He started his search methodically, his eyes scanning the ground, ignoring the larger pieces of debris. He was looking for the insignificant, the overlooked. A button, a scrap of fabric, a footprint that didn't belong. But days of foot traffic and the cleansing rain had likely washed away any obvious signs. The alley was a public space in the most private of ways, a shortcut for laborers and a playground for stray cats. Finding a single clue here would be like finding a specific grain of rice in a sack. An old woman, her back bent like a willow branch, was sweeping the stoop of a small home that opened directly into the alley. Her broom scraped rhythmically against the stone, a lonely, scratching sound. Park approached her slowly, keeping his hands out of his pockets. "Excuse me, Halmione," he said, his voice gentle. "I am a police detective. I need to ask if you saw anything unusual a few nights ago." The sweeping stopped. She squinted at him, her eyes milky with age. "Unusual?" she rasped, her voice thin as paper. "Young man, everything in this neighborhood is unusual since the war. Nothing is as it should be. What is one more strange thing?" "I'm looking for a man who might have been with a small boy," Park pressed. "Perhaps you heard something, a car, a shout?" She leaned on her broom, considering. There are always shouts. Children cry, men drink and yell. A car? No, not in this alley, too narrow. She gestured with her chin towards the far end. "They come through on foot, always in a hurry." She gave him a final, dismissive look and resumed her sweeping, the rhythmic scrape a clear signal that the conversation was over. He was just another unpleasantness to be swept away. Frustration gnawed at him. He continued deeper into the alley, his polished shoes now coated in a thin layer of muck. He kicked at a pile of sodden newspapers, the ink bleeding into a gray pulp. And that's when he saw it. Tucked against the grimy foundation of the wall, almost perfectly camouflaged, was a small object. It wasn't a rock or a piece of trash. He knelt, his knees protesting, and picked it up with 2 fingers. It was a bird, crudely carved from a piece of light-colored wood, no bigger than his thumb. The wings were slightly uneven, the tail a simple fan, but the form was unmistakable. It was the work of a child's hands. He remembered Mrs. Kang's choked words through her sobs. He was always carving. Little things he found, bits of wood. He made birds mostly, said they could fly away. Park closed his hand around the small wooden effigy. Its fragile form felt impossibly heavy. This was it. This was where Min-jun was taken. The killer hadn't just taken the boy, he had stolen his flight. Meanwhile, across the city, Officer Kim was navigating a different kind of alleyway, the labyrinthine corridors of Seoul National University. The air here was clean, smelling of old paper, floor wax, and intellectual dust. The suspect was wealthy, well-spoken, and interested in rare German technology. To Kim, that spelled academic, or, at the very least, someone who moved in those circles. His request for a list of faculty members with known interests in foreign audio equipment was met with a wall of bureaucratic condescension. The dean's assistant, a stern man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked at Kim's simple police uniform as if it were an insult. "Officer," the man said, his tone icy, "we are an institution of higher learning, not a registry for hobbyists. We cannot simply divulge personal information about our esteemed faculty for a fishing expedition." "A child is dead," Kim said, his voice flat and devoid of the politeness he usually employed. The statement hung in the quiet office, stark and ugly. "The man who killed him is educated, meticulous. He used a German reel-to-reel recorder. Someone here might have sold it to him, consulted with him, or might even be him. I am not fishing, sir. I am following the only lead I have." The assistant's composure cracked slightly. He cleared his throat and shuffled some papers. "That is regrettable, but I cannot help you. University policy." Defeated, Kim turned to leave. As he reached the door, a younger clerk working at a side desk caught his eye and gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod towards the hallway. Kim paused, thanked the assistant for his time, and stepped outside. A moment later, the young clerk followed, carrying a stack of files as a pretense. "I shouldn't be doing this," the clerk whispered, not making eye contact. "But what you said, a child," he shifted his weight. "There isn't a list, but there are whispers. Professor Yoon Thwan, German Literature Department. He is from a wealthy family, studied in Europe before the war. He's intense, very particular about sound. He has his own private collection of audio equipment, imports it himself. Students say he records them during oral exams to analyze their pronunciation. They call him the Listener. The nickname sent a chill down Kim's spine. Yoon T.H.Wan, he repeated, etching the name into his memory. Where can I find him? He keeps to himself, has a private office in the old wing. But he took a sudden leave of absence. 3 days ago, cited a family emergency. 3 days ago, the day after Min-jun was reported missing, it was too precise to be a coincidence. Kim felt a surge of adrenaline. This was more than a lead. It was a name, a face, a story that fit the contours of their faceless killer perfectly. That evening, the two men met back at the cramped station. The air was thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and brewed barley tea. Park placed the small wooden bird on the desk between them. It looked tiny and vulnerable under the harsh electric light. Kim looked from the bird to his partner's grim face. He was there, Park said quietly. This was his. Kim nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. He opened his notepad to a fresh page. In the center, he wrote a single name, Yoon T.H.Wan. And I think I know who was waiting for him. The name hung in the stale air of the precinct office like smoke from a just-extinguished match. Professor Yoon T.H.Wan. The Listener. It was a persona, a mask, and Detective Park Jin-woo knew that behind it lay the face of a monster. He and Officer Kim stood before a large, cluttered corkboard. A crude map of Seoul was pinned in the center, with threads connecting the Namsan Children's Home, the dark alley, and now, the sprawling campus of Seoul National University. A respected professor of German literature, Park mused, his voice raspy with fatigue. Wealthy, well-spoken, meticulous, it's the perfect camouflage. It's not enough for a warrant, sir, Kim stated, ever the pragmatist. A shared hobby and a convenient leave of absence are circumstantial. The prosecutor will laugh us out of his office. We need to connect Yoon to that alley. We need to build a clearer picture of the man. Their first stop was back at the university, this time not for discreet inquiries, but for formal interviews. The campus, with its hopeful air of reconstruction and intellectual pursuit, felt alien to the grim nature of their task. They were directed to the office of Professor Lim Byung-ho, the head of the literature department and a colleague of Yoon's for over a decade. Professor Lim was a small, bird-like man with spectacles that perpetually slid down his nose. He wrung his hands as he spoke, his initial praise for Yoon's academic brilliance slowly curdling into unease. T.H.Wan is a singular mind, he began, choosing his words with care. His analyses of Goethe are unparalleled, but his passions extend beyond the written word. His audio equipment, Park prompted, keeping his tone neutral. Lim nodded vigorously. An obsession. He called it his acoustic library of humanity. He would record everything. The chatter of the markets, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmiths, the cries of street vendors. He claimed he was preserving the true voice of our city as it recovered. The professor paused, pushing his glasses up. But sometimes, it felt less like preservation and more like collection, like an entomologist pinning butterflies to a board. Did he ever record people without their knowledge? Kim asked, his pen poised over his notepad. He was fascinated by what he called pure sound, unfiltered human expression, Lim admitted, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Laughter, crying. He once gave a lecture on the acoustic properties of a baby's first cry versus the wail of a grieving widow. Some students found it brilliant. Others were disturbed. He believed that the most honest sounds were the ones made when people thought no one was listening. That sentence chilled Park to the bone. The most honest sounds, the screams on the tape. They were pure, honest terror. Armed with Lim's unsettling testimony, they secured their meeting with the chief prosecutor. Park laid it all out. The tape arriving before the report, the voice confirmed as Min-jun's, the rare German recorder, the electronics dealer's description matching Yoon, the terrified witness in Soo-jin, the carved bird found in the alley, and now, the psychological profile of a man obsessed with capturing pure sound. It was a chain of circumstantial evidence, but each link was forged in solid police work. The prosecutor, a grim man who had seen the war's worst, signed the search warrant for Yoon T.H.Wan's home and office. Professor Yoon lived in Seongbukdong, a quiet, hilly neighborhood that had largely escaped the war's devastation. His house was a stark anomaly, a modern structure of clean lines, dark wood, and large glass windows, a piece of German Bauhaus minimalism transplanted into the heart of Seoul. It stood silent and imposing. They forced the front door. The silence inside was absolute, a heavy, sterile void. The interior was as meticulous as the exterior. Not a speck of dust marred the polished floors. Books were arranged not by author, but by size. It was the home of a man who craved order, who exerted absolute control over his environment. They moved through the house, their footsteps echoing unnaturally. The study was a shrine to his dual obsessions. One wall was floor-to-ceiling books, German philosophy, acoustic engineering, anatomical charts of the human larynx. The other wall was filled with hundreds of reel-to-reel tapes, each in its own box with a small, typed label on the spine. Park pulled one out. Summer rain on a Hanok roof. The next read, Cicadas, Changdeok Palace, dusk. It was exactly as Professor Lim had described. An acoustic library. "Sir, over here," Kim called from across the room. He was standing before a heavy wooden door that looked like it belonged to a bank vault, completely out of place with the rest of the home's airy design. It was locked from the outside with a heavy deadbolt. It took a crowbar and the combined weight of 2 officers to splinter the frame and force it open. The air that spilled out was cold and dead. The room was small, no bigger than a pantry, and its walls were covered in thick, dark acoustic foam. It was a soundproof box. A tomb. In the center of the room stood a single wooden chair. Facing it was a professional-grade microphone on a heavy stand. And on a small, steel table next to it sat the source of their nightmares. A Telefunken tape recorder, the exact model the Myeongdong dealer had described. But it was what lay beside the recorder that made Park's blood run cold. There was a small, single shoe, caked with dirt and worn through at the toe. It was cheap, mass-produced, the kind of shoe an orphan living on scraps would wear. It was Min Jun's. Next to the shoe was a fresh reel of tape, still in its box, unlabeled. A blank canvas waiting for its next subject. Park felt a wave of nausea. This was not just a listening room, it was a studio. A stage for capturing the pure sound of suffering. He picked up the small shoe, its pathetic weight a testament to the life that had been stolen. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. It was tangible, horrifying proof. They had found the predator's lair. Park turned to Kim, his face a mask of cold fury. The silence of the house pressed in on them, heavy with the ghosts of unspeakable acts. "Issue an arrest warrant," Park said, his voice low and hard as granite. "I want every officer in the city to have his face. Find him. Find Professor Yoon Thwan. Now." The air in Professor Yoon's sterile house hung thick and cold, poisoned by the discovery in the soundproofed room. The sight of Min Jun's small, scuffed shoe on the polished concrete floor had transformed the investigation from a hunt for a predator into a desperate race against time. For Park, the shoe was an anchor, pulling him down into a cold rage. It was no longer an abstract case file, it was a tangible piece of a stolen childhood. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was electric. News of a Seoul National University professor being the prime suspect in a child's abduction sent shockwaves through the department. An arrest warrant for Yoon Thwan was issued with unprecedented speed, and his photograph, a stark, academic portrait that revealed nothing of the monster beneath, was distributed to every police outpost and checkpoint in and out of the city. The manhunt began. Park and Kim, fueled by black coffee and a shared, unspoken urgency, spearheaded the effort. They were chasing a ghost, a man of intellect and means. "He's meticulous," Park said, pacing in front of the evidence board, now dominated by Yoon's face. "He wouldn't make a simple mistake. He wouldn't just run." Their first avenues of inquiry hit immediate walls. Yoon's bank accounts were untouched. No large withdrawals, no signs of panic. He had likely been operating with cash for some time. His known associates and university colleagues were stunned into uselessness, offering no insight into where he might have gone. They described a man who was a recluse by nature, his only sanctuary being his home, the very crime scene they had just dismantled. Days began to blur. The citywide search yielded nothing. Checkpoints reported no sightings. Yoon seemed to have vanished from the face of the earth, as if he'd been absorbed into the city's concrete and shadows. Frustration mounted, gnawing at Park's resolve. Every dead end felt like another handful of soil being thrown onto Minjun's chances. He found himself staring at the small wooden bird on his desk, its crudely carved wings a constant, silent accusation. He had failed to protect the boy. He could not fail to find his captor. It was Kim, ever the diligent, methodical officer, who broke the stalemate. While Park was consumed by the suspect's psychology, Kim was buried in paperwork, cross-referencing property deeds, tax records, and family registries, a mountain of dry documents that held the city's secrets. Hyung Nim, Kim said, his voice quiet but firm, breaking the tense silence of their makeshift office late one night. He slid a dusty folder across the desk. I found something. It's not under his name. It belonged to his parents, who died years ago. The property was never sold, just forgotten. A small house in Gangwon Province near Chuncheon. Park's eyes locked onto the address. Gangwon Province. Remote, mountainous. The perfect place for a man to disappear, especially one who sought isolation. It was a long shot, a piece of a life Yoon had seemingly left behind, but it was the only real lead they had. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through Park's exhaustion. Within the hour, they were on the road, heading east in an unmarked police sedan with two other detectives. The sprawling, wounded city of Seoul gradually gave way to sleeping towns and then to darkness. The paved roads thinned, becoming winding dirt tracks that climbed into the mountains. A thick fog rolled down the slopes, swallowing the headlights and reducing visibility to a few feet. The air grew cold, heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine. The silence in the car was absolute, a shared vessel for their anxiety and grim anticipation. Park gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. This was it. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. A man like Yoon wouldn't hide in a flophouse or try to blend into a crowd. He would retreat to a place he could control, a kingdom of his own making. This forgotten house was his fortress. After another hour of navigating the treacherous mountain roads, they found it. Tucked away in a small, fog-shrouded valley, stood a traditional hanok, its dark-tiled roof barely visible against the night sky. It was utterly isolated, no other lights for miles around. The house was dark, appearing dormant, but a thin wisp of smoke curled from its chimney, a faint, ghostly signal of life within. They killed the engine and coasted the final 100 meters, the crunch of gravel under the tires sounding like cannon shots in the profound silence. Park gave the signal. They exited the car, weapons drawn, their movements practiced and silent. The cold air burned in their lungs. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot felt amplified. As they approached the main gate, a sound drifted from within the house, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't a scream, it was music. A classical German lied, its melancholic melody a surreal and chilling counterpoint to the tension of the moment. Park didn't hesitate. There would be no negotiation, no standoff. He nodded to the detective beside him, who slammed a heavy iron ram against the old wooden gate. The wood splintered with a deafening crack. Park was the first one through, his pistol leading the way into the courtyard. The music was louder now, pouring from the main house. He moved swiftly across the yard, Kim and the others fanning out behind him. He reached the paper screen door of the main room and without a pause kicked it open. The paper tore, the wooden frame shattering inward. Inside, sitting calmly in a simple wooden chair at a low table, was Professor Yoon Thwan. He was dressed in a clean, simple robe. In front of him sat a lit candle, a cup of tea, and a reel-to-reel tape recorder, the source of the music. He didn't look surprised or scared. He simply turned his head slowly, his eyes, unnervingly placid, meeting Park's. A faint, almost curious smile touched his lips. "Detective Park," he said, his voice as smooth and articulate as the electronics dealer had described. I was wondering when you would arrive. The air in the traditional hanok was thick with the scent of pine wood and old paper. Professor Yoon Thwan sat perfectly still behind a low wooden table, a steaming cup of tea before him. He was dressed in a simple gray hanbok, his hands resting in his lap. He showed no surprise, no fear. His expression was one of serene, academic curiosity, as if he had been expecting them all along. Detective Park Jin-woo, his heart hammering against his ribs, stood in the doorway, his pistol held low but steady. Behind him, Officer Kim and two other policemen filled the narrow frame, their heavy breaths fogging in the cool mountain air. "Detective Park," Yoon said, his voice calm and even a stark contrast to the violence of the tape. "I was wondering when you would arrive. Please come in. The journey from Seoul is a long one." Park's jaw tightened. He took a step forward, his shoes scuffing on the polished wooden floor. "No more games, Professor. The search is over." Yoon smiled faintly, a chilling, detached expression that didn't reach his eyes. A search implies something is lost. I would argue nothing was ever lost. Merely documented. He gestured to a corner of the room where, sitting on a silk cushion like a revered idol, was the tape recorder. "We found the shoe, Yoon," Kim interjected, his voice raw with anger. "In your soundproof room, we have the tape. We know what you did." The professor tilted his head, considering Kim's words. "What I did. You see it as an act of crude violence. A crime, I see it as preservation. Art, even. Do you know how fleeting purity is, detective?" he asked, his gaze settling on Park. "A child's laughter, a bird's song. A boy's humming on a crisp autumn day. These are perfect, transient moments. But fear, true, unadulterated terror, that is the most pure sound of all. It is an emotion stripped of all artifice, all social conditioning. It is the soul screaming its raw truth." Park felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't the confession of a monster, it was the lecture of a madman. "You're talking about a child, Min-jun, a boy you terrorized." "I gave him a form of immortality," Yoon countered, his voice rising with conviction. "That recording will outlive us all. It is a perfect specimen of human expression, captured at its peak, before he could be corrupted by the world, by the grime of survival in a place like that orphanage. I saved his innocence by shattering it." The cold, clinical logic was more horrifying than any scream. Park took another step, his knuckles white around the grip of his pistol. He slammed his free hand down on the table, rattling the teacup. "I don't care about your philosophy. I don't care about your art. Where is he? Is he alive?" For the first time, a flicker of something annoyance perhaps crossed Yoon's face. The boy was an afterthought, a vessel for the sound he had coveted. The instrument had served its purpose. "The recording is finished," he said dismissively. "The subject is no longer relevant to my work." He gestured vaguely towards a heavy wooden door at the back of the main room. "He is in the cellar." He was becoming noisy. It interfered with the quiet I require for reflection. A surge of adrenaline shot through Park. He didn't wait for another word. "Kim, stay with him," he yelled, holstering his weapon and lunging for the door. It was barred from the outside with a heavy wooden plank. He tore it away, his muscles screaming with the effort, and pulled the heavy door open, revealing a set of steep, stone steps leading down into absolute darkness. "Min-jun," he called out, his voice echoing in the cold, damp space. A small, whimpering sound answered him from the blackness below. One of the officers passed Park a flashlight, and he aimed its beam down the stairs. Huddled in the far corner of the small, stone-walled cellar was a small figure, wrapped in a thin, dirty blanket. It was Min-jun. His face was stained with tears and dirt, his eyes wide with a terror that was now utterly silent. He didn't scream. He just stared, trembling, at the light. Park descended the stairs slowly, his heart aching. "Min-jun," he said softly, keeping his voice gentle. "It's okay now. We're the police. We've come to take you home." He knelt down, reaching out a hand. The boy flinched but didn't pull away. In that small, silent cellar, Park saw the true cost of Yoon's art. It wasn't a preserved sound. It was a shattered soul. He gently wrapped the boy in his own coat and carried him up the stairs, back into the light. As Park emerged with the child, he saw that Kim and the others had Yoon in handcuffs. The professor watched them with the same unnerving detachment, his eyes not on the boy he had tormented, but on the detective. "You see, detective," Yoon said calmly as they led him away. "The sound is gone. All that's left is this empty shell. But I have the recording. I have the truth of that moment forever." Park didn't respond. He held Min-jun tighter and walked past the monster, out of the house and into the cold, clean air of the mountains. The journey back to Seoul was quiet. Min-jun slept fitfully in the back seat, occasionally crying out. Back at the Namsan Children's Home, Mrs. Kang wept with relief, hugging the boy tightly. Park watched as another child, the quiet girl Soo-jin, saw Min-jun from across the courtyard. Her perpetually fearful expression softened, and for the first time since Park had met her, a small, fragile smile touched her lips. It was a silent testament, a victory more meaningful than any confession. Days later, Park sat alone in his office late at night. The city lights of Seoul twinkled outside his window. On the corner of his desk sat the evidence bag containing the reel-to-reel tape from Yoon's house. He had no desire to ever hear it again. The case was closed. Yoon T-hwan would spend the rest of his life in prison, a footnote in the annals of crime, his twisted philosophy silenced. But Park knew the echoes of the case would remain. He had looked into a peculiar, chilling darkness, a void where human life was worth less than a sound wave. He had pulled a child back from that abyss, but he knew the boy and he himself would carry the scars. He stood up, turned off his desk lamp, and looked out at the sprawling city. It was a place of endless stories, of struggles and sorrows, and it was his job to listen, not to the screams, but to the silence that followed, and to fight for the justice that could, sometimes, fill it.